Hi guys, in today's video we are going to continue looking at working with these delicate types of fabrics and how to finish them, but for these types of finishes it's on the exterior. So the hemline, the sleeve finish, or a neckline finish. There's all different techniques that you can use on a standard sewing machine to successfully and beautifully finish these garments. I'm going to bring Melinda back to join us again on this topic of hemming and finishing the edges of your garment with these types of fabrics. She has a few great tutorials that we can look at together, and then go ahead and follow along and start to practice these techniques to really just build your skill set.
First, let's talk about hems. Hems are one of the most traditional edge finishes, and rightly so. They're simple, and yet they do their job excellently of just finishing an edge with usually one or two folds of material. There are many different types of hems. You can have a single fold hem, a double fold hem, a faced hem, a catch stitched hem, a hem that is actually bound with bias. You can add horsehair braid to your hem. There's lots of options. Personally, I really do love adding a ribbon facing to the inside of my hems. Again, it's another little pop of color and detail that people don't expect. On the outside, the garment just looks like it's plain fashion fabric. You can concentrate on the lines of the details of the garment. But when you look inside, there's just this cheerful pop of color or texture that you didn't expect. The ribbon or trim does double as an edge finish, and it doesn't add extra bulk. So sometimes with fabrics you don't want that lump that's caused by a double turn hem. You can just add this piece of trim or ribbon over the raw edge and it will lay flatter than a double turn hem. A good example of this is a little custom order I did a couple years ago. It's a little sundress made in navy blue cotton with lots of cheerful white bows. The inspiration dress had a white skirt lining, so I went ahead and duplicated that. But to add some extra interest, I used a white cotton trim on the inside of the fashion fabric hem. This sort of mimicked the white themes in the dress, but also helped finish the edge and gave it that unexpected little pop of surprise. I also wanted to show you an easy technique for trimming away the extra seam allowance from a folded edge. This is a great technique to use when you're hemming shears, for example. When you fold over one edge, stitch, trim away the extra, and then fold it over again to make a tiny hemmed edge. So with this sample here, I've actually gone ahead and pressed under one edge, stitched about 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch away, and then I'm going to use scissors to trim this off. Now you can use fancy applique scissors like this one. They have a built-in little bill here to help push away the lower layer of fabric. These are great if you have them, but if you just have ordinary dressmaking shears, it's still pretty easy to trim off this extra seam allowance using the palms up technique. And what that means is you want to hold the fabric in your non-cutting hand with your palm up, and then you want to turn your scissors hand so that your palms are also facing up. This will enable you to slip the blade in between the layers and cut right next to the seam line. Now you do have to be careful because the points of your scissors can easily snag a hole in your lower layer, but just take your time with this and remember to put both palms up, and it will be a great help to you in trimming away these little bits of extra seam allowances from a fold. To sew a hand-rolled hem, first mark your hemline on your fabric. Run a line of stay stitching 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch away from your marked hemline. Keep in mind that the distance between the stitch line and the hemline is going to be the finished depth of your hem. Cut away the excess seam allowance so that the amount to the right of the stay stitching is about the same amount as the distance between the hemline and the stay stitching. Anchor your thread at one end, then take a tiny stitch out of the fashion fabric just above the marked hemline, and then catch the stay stitching with your needle. Roll the hem with your fingers to finish it. And here's the completed hand-rolled hem. As you can see, it makes a very, very narrow, lightweight finish on the edge of this fabric. You can use the sewing machine to help you create some variations of the basic rolled hem. I've just pressed over my seam allowance and stitched about 1/8 of an inch in from the fold. Then I'm clipping away this seam allowance here. Now at this point you've got a couple options for what to do to finish the edge. One of the techniques we like to use at Liberty Jane is just simply to zigzag over this edge as is. That will hold the raw edges in check, and it will also keep this edge pretty lightweight. I like to sometimes fold this tiny 1/8 of an inch bit over one more time, and then I can sometimes machine top stitch this down for a sturdier finish, or if I'm looking for a really delicate finish on a slippery fabric, I will actually fold it over, slip stitch it down, and then sometimes I'll even remove this original line of stitching so that it gives the same effect as a hand-rolled hem, but it's lighter weight because we've removed the extra line of machine stitching. Using the lining as a hem is one of my favorite techniques. I'm going to show you how to do that next. Here I have drawn up a basic sort of skirt pattern. This would be the waistline, the center front fold, and this is my desired finished hem length. Now to figure out how long to cut the fashion fabric and the lining fabric, I'm just going to go ahead and decide how much of the fashion fabric I want showing on the inside of my garment. So for this example, I think I want about 3/8 of an inch showing. Just going to go ahead and draw that on. Now, so that my skirt comes out the correct length, I'm going to also subtract this distance from the finished hemline. Then all that I have to do is actually add seam allowances to both of these lines, and I will establish my cutting line for the lining and my cutting line for the fashion fabric. When it comes time to construct the skirt, just sew the lining and the fashion fabric together along the hemline edge. I usually like to press the seam open and do something decorative with top stitching along the seam. And then fold the skirt up so that the raw edges line up at the waistline, and you should have created a fold in the fashion fabric that will then serve as your hem. A great example of this is the skirt from the Melody Valerie Transcontinental dress. This is part of the pattern proof, and if we look inside, you can see where the fashion fabric and the lining meet. There's actually this fold in the fashion fabric because the lining is cut shorter, and this fold is what becomes the hemmed edge. Another really lovely technique is using a ribbon or a piece of trim to face a hemline. In this example, my hemline is about 1 inch up from the raw edge, so I'm just going to mark that with my chalk wheel. Then I'm going to take my piece of ribbon here and place it so that it covers the raw edge, and then stitch it into position to the fashion fabric. If you're having a hard time sewing the ribbon or trim on straight, you can also chalk mark a placement line for the edge of the trim. That will ensure that you lap over the raw edge of the fashion fabric at an even amount. When your trim or ribbon is attached, press up along the chalked hemline and then hand slip stitch or catch stitch this faced edge into place. The chalk marking is part of ensuring that you fold up the hemline at the correct depth, since adding the ribbon or trim to the edge is going to actually lengthen the edge. You can also use this technique if you don't have a very large hem allowance and you wish to extend it by sewing on a wider piece of ribbon or trim and just overlapping it very slightly with the raw edge. Another great edge finish is the facing. Facings are just cut pieces of fabric. They're shaped to match the edge of the garment. They're stitched to the edge of the garment. The seam is clipped and then turned to the inside, and that facing is just a shaped piece of fabric that lies along the inside of the garment. Facings are usually cut to match the shape of the garment, but they can sometimes be just cut as an extension of the outer piece. A good example of this is the Liberty Jane crop jacket, where the facing is actually just cut from the center front as just an extension of that front piece, and then it's folded back on itself. Couturiers often prefer the folded facing, as it's called, to the cut facing when it's possible, because that fold line is the absolute minimum of bulk compared to a stitch line with seam allowances. Both cut and folded facings allow for an extremely neat finish on the inside of the garment. A couple good examples of facings are, again, that Liberty Jane crop jacket, but also the Do Kiss dress, where I cut a neckline facing to finish the edge of all of those pleats that radiate around the neckline and shoulders. To create a neckline facing, You're going to draw around your bodice piece at the front, the neckline, and then the shoulder edge. We're going to be tracing around a sloper in this example, but in the real world, you'd be tracing around your finished bodice piece to get a facing that was the correct shape for your garment. Next, use your ruler and measure off the depth of your facing. In this case, I'm going to draw a 3/4 inch deep facing. I'm going to dot it, and then when the neckline curves, I'm just going to move the ruler so that once again it's lined up with the curve. And continue dotting until I reach the shoulder. At this point, you can connect your dots with a smooth line to create your facing stitch line. To add seam allowance to the bottom edge of your facing, simply get your ruler out again and draw on another 1/4 inch along the bottom, just like you did before. Before you cut out your facing, it can be helpful to add any other seam allowances your pattern will need, such as along the neckline and the shoulder line. It's also a good idea to mark center front so that you know where that is. To create a matching back facing for your garment, the steps are exactly the same. You'll trace around the neckline, shoulder, and center back, and then draw in your facing line. Just make sure that the width of your facing at the shoulder is the same in the back as in the front. This Liberty Jane bib top has got some great examples of facings. If you look at the inside, there's a nice narrow facing along the back edge, and then in the front, there's a very deep facing to mimic the size of the bib on the front. A binding is a strip of fabric that encases a raw edge. Bindings are a little bit different than facings. Facings are usually just functional and they only go on the inside of a garment. A binding, because it wraps the raw edge, can be decorative as well as functional. They're usually shaped rather than cut to be the right shape, because usually bindings are a strip of fabric cut on the bias that can be curved to match whatever shape it is you're trying to finish. Binding is usually cut on the bias, but there are times where a straight grain piece of binding works just as well, usually on a straight edge. Bindings can stand by themselves, though, to finish an edge. A good example of this is the Melody Valerie New Girl dress. There's a bias binding around the hem that actually serves as the finishing edge to the bottom of the dress. Bias strips in general, though, are just wonderful for finishing waistlines and armscys. One of the most distinctive features of Melody Valerie dresses is that I use bias strips to bind the armscys. This works for sleeveless dresses as well as for designs with sleeves. Basically, I sew the bias binding into a strip, fold it in half so that, again, I have that folded edge. Then I stitch it to the armscye and clip the seam allowances and fell the fold to the other side of the seam line. This is a somewhat labor-intensive technique, but I think it really adds an extra level of luxury that people don't expect. Having an armscye that is finished beautifully with a corresponding contrasting fabric that's been done in the round is a mark of craftsmanship that I think a lot of people don't expect, and part of how I try to help reset people's expectations about what doll clothing can be. Of course, if sewing armscys in the round is not for you, you can definitely still add binding at the armscys before sewing the underarm and side seams.
All right, so those are a few of my favorite techniques for finishing these types of fabrics. I hope that you were able to follow along and really absorb the techniques taught, and that you're able to apply these to the projects that you're working on.